So I'm going to give people a minute or two to come in, and then we're going to start the webinar.
Wait, are we talking about biophilia today? Because I feel like I kind of am.
That's a really cool place you're in.
Susan designed it.
Oh, so nice.
If you have to be without electricity because of the big storm, this is the place to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Your connection seems great. So it worked out for the best.
If I drop out, please go on without me.
So we're going to get started. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. This webinar series is a platform for CNU members and like-minded people to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues related to urban places and people. We've got a great webinar today on the subject of form-based codes in America with Emily Talon and Hazel Boris, and discussion with interviewer and moderator Luiza Leite. And form-based codes have been a part of the new urbanism right from the beginning. New urbanists were faced with a regulatory system that made it pretty much illegal to build walkable places all across America when they started the project of trying to build mixed-use walkable places again. And this project has been underway for the better part of 40 years, and it's gone through many different phases. It's especially gained momentum in the last 20 years, where hundreds of cities and towns across America have adopted codes that had form-based elements to them. And we're going to be hearing more about that in this presentation. We're going to be hearing about trends and latest developments in form-based codes and research by Emily Talon on really the social impacts of form-based codes. We're going to so share your thoughts on hashtag on the park bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB feedback. And I'd like to remind everybody to keep in mind CNU 30 in Oklahoma City, save the dates. It's March 23rd through 26th, 2022, and it's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. Yay, everybody's excited about that. At this one, you can learn how a clear commitment to urbanism, careful financing, and resident engagement can spark a city's renaissance. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU30. Our first panelist, Emily Talon, is a professor of urbanism at the University of Chicago, where she teaches urban design and directs the Urbanism Lab. She holds a PhD in urban geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's degree in city planning from Ohio State. She's a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Talon has written extensively on the topics of urban design, new urbanism, and social equity. Her books include New Urbanism and American Planning, Design for Diversity, Urban Design Reclaimed, City Rules, and Neighborhood. She is co-editor of the Journal of Urbanism. Our other panelist today is Hazel Boris, president of Placemakers Inc. in Canada and Placemakers LLC in the US, both city planning firms. Are passionate about walkable urban and rural places and believe that diverse, character-rich neighborhoods can reduce the velocity of climate change while significantly increasing well-being and resilience. She guides governments around the world through policy and land use law reforms and helps developers get things built under the increasingly prevalent form-based development bylaws of the new economy. Hazel is an engineer with an MBA specializing in finance and marketing. She is co-author of the Pandemic Toolkit, codestudy.org, codescore.org, and Hazel is a Placeshakers.com blogger and serves on the boards of the Winnipeg Foundation and the Transect Codes Council, and is a member of the Winnipeg Art Gallery Associates. Our interviewer and moderator today is Luiza Leite, and she was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and raised in Miami, and has lived in New York City. She holds degrees in economics and communications from New York University, as well as a Master of Architecture from the University of Miami School of Architecture. Since 2016, she's been working as an urban designer, town planner, and project director at Dover Kohl Partners, where she is currently leading projects that range from equity-focused municipal planning in downtown Oakland, California, to a health and wellness village center in Estero, Florida, for the Lee Health Memorial Public Health System, to a new form-based code for the city of Punta Gorda, Florida. In addition to her skills as an illustrator and street designer, Luiza has a special interest and expertise in the areas of social and economic and environmental resilience. Today, we're going to have a presentation by the panel, followed by a discussion with the panel and moderator, and followed by Q&A from the audience. So please have your questions ready. Type them into the Q&A function of Zoom as they occur to you, because they will probably be answered more or less in the order that they were asked. With that, I'm going to pass this along to the panelists to share their screen.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. I would like to lead off, but Luiza is being kind enough to share my presentation because we had a big storm last night and I have no electricity here. So thanks for that, Luiza. I'm not going to spend much, pardon?
Is it sure thing?
Okay, thanks. I'm not going to spend much time here because the reason we're really here today is to hear Emily's new research findings on her latest paper, which is incredibly thorough and thought-provoking on the subject of the impacts of form-based codes from 2000 to 2010 to 2020 across the United States. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background for that and then pass it off to her. Next slide, please. So since before I start, though, I just want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is located on Treaty 1, the original lands and waters of the Anishinaabe, Inawak, Ashinawak, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nations, committing ourselves to reconciliation and moving forward in a spirit of peace. Next slide. So, and about 2006, 2007, we started codestudy.org, the analysis of what codes across the United States, Canada, and globally conform with Form-Based Code Institute criteria. That is co-authored with Dr. Talon and Matt Lambert. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we started noticing were these regional concentrations within different states and provinces in the US and Canada, where most of the form-based codes are. The older form-based codes, however, certainly originated in Seaside and then have been more prevalent in the US, which is why Dr. Talon's study is focused in on that. Next slide, please. But one of the things also to note is within that time frame from 2000 to 2010 and now to 2020 that her study contemplates, that is when the preponderance of form-based codes have been adopted. 92% of them have been adopted since 2001. Next slide, please. And also on that previous slide, don't go back, but the point there, the current year is actually codes that are in process. And so the graph is intentionally skewed, but just the point is that it's that more of them are underway than have been adopted to date significantly. The other thing, though, about codesstudy.org is the fact that it's a completely volunteer effort that's never been funded. So we don't always, we aren't always able to track adoption rates. And if you have a form-based code that's adopted that's not reflected, please do send it to us. From CNU Louisville, we had a form-based code boot camp there in which we tried to, as part of an open space format, get folks to start thinking about what their elevator speeches would be on the subject of why cities and towns and rural municipalities and counties and states and provinces want to adopt this sort of land use law that allows a compact settlement pattern, that allows a mixture of compatible uses, that is transit ready instead of the transit impervious, more suburban formats that we have been predominantly building over this last 75 years. And so from that CNU Louisville conversation, Code Score was born. That is co-authored by my partner, Cade Benfield, and me. And what we do in codescore.org is we look at our favorite 135 mostly peer-reviewed studies that tie the shape of place back to the return on investment, to the environment, to economy, and to the well-being of society. So what we try to do within those 135 studies is look at what the findings are that the predominant drivers of the studies are, and what the indicators of those drivers are, and the behaviors. So the studies find that walkability and access to nature predominantly increase physical well-being for a vast array of reasons, and that nature-rich active environments generally increase psychological well-being, that walkability, short commutes, and civic space increase social capital, that a variety of housing sizes and types tend to increase affordability, that affordable housing and transportation together tend to reduce crime, and that all drivers from the people category increase longevity. Next slide, please. Then with respect to environmental indicators, infill, compact, mixed use, and street connectivity tend to decrease vehicle miles traveled along with greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm hoping that Emily's next study dives more deeply into, or perhaps in Q&A we can talk about that some more. And that compact, mixed use, and transit access decrease automobile trips per week, and that compact land development patterns increase land and ecosystem conservation and watershed protection, and that all drivers from the planet category increase air and water quality. Next slide, please. Then from an economic perspective, the 135 studies generally find that pent-up demand for walkability shows an indicator of new construction increases. Compact development patterns tend to increase jobs per acre. Nature, green space, and walkability tend to increase property value. Compact transit accessible mixed use tend to decrease housing transportation cost. Compact development patterns tend to decrease household energy and water cost. Tend to increase tax revenue per acre back to the local unit of local government, and tend to decrease infrastructure cost for both governments and private developers, and tend to decrease service costs over time. And then all drivers from the people category tend to decrease healthcare cost. And then all drivers from the profit category increased return on investment. So codescore.org definitely, and then, when you go there, get excerpts from all of the different studies along with hyperlinks to go check them out yourselves. But what codescore.org does is looks generally at these 135 studies and then ties them back to the sorts of development patterns that form-based codes usually generate. But next slide, please. What Dr. Talon's work does so thoughtfully and thoroughly is actually looks very carefully at specific form-based codes compared to surrounding areas over time. So while for codestudy.org, which is what her study pulls from, I just want to give you all on today's Zoom a special request that if your form-based codes that you've written or been involved with or know about that comply with Form-Based Code Institute criteria, if they are not listed on codestudy.org, or they aren't shown as adopted there, if you wouldn't mind submitting them to us, just email them to me, hazel@placemakers.com. You'll have to confirm you're human. Sorry about that spam filter. Or tweet them over to me at @Boris. That would be much appreciated because all of these studies have benefited from contributions from thousands of people over the decades. So we really appreciate your help on that. And with that, I will hand it over to Emily.
Emily, will you be sharing your screen? So I'll take this
Will
down.
be.
Okay.
So I guess I need to be given that option, or let's see.
I think you'll be able
Looks like-
to.
I have that option, yay. Okay, everybody's seeing that all right? Okay, so are you looking at a screen that says landscape and urban planning?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Hazel, and please call me Emily. We know each other too well. Yeah, thanks so much for that overview. Hazel is just doing an amazing job, and she has been over the years tracking form-based codes. And, you know, there is no entity out there doing this work. I mean, this is really a crowdsourced kind of thing. And thank God for Hazel taking the lead on compiling this information. So what I wanted to do is, and I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I finally found the bandwidth to pull it all together, is look at what are the socioeconomic associations of form-based codes. And so it's not really looking at the impact of form-based codes, because that would imply some kind of causality. It's really looking at what kinds of places are adopting form-based codes. What are these communities? Because, and one motivation for looking at this is that you do tend to hear the critique more and more that form-based codes are just a white people thing and associated with affluence, and, you know, oh, there's another new urbanist thing that's, you know, not about communities of color. And so I just wanted to let the data speak for itself on that. So it's really about looking at these associations. And so what I did was I just thought about, okay, what are we trying to do with form-based codes? What would be an association with a form-based code area or community that, you know, that we would like to see associated? And so I think what that boils down to would be some kind of equity and diversity and density. And those are three kinds of associations that we might like to see. So I used census data to pair with form-based code locations to see what these relationships are really looking like. Let's see. Okay, so there was a lot of work put into trying to figure out, okay, where are these form-based codes? And how do we actually locate them within census tracts? And then what do we compare them to? So using Hazel's data set that she's been working on over the years. I started with her form-based codes list in the code study, and I whittled it down a little bit in several ways. I did not look at codes that were not adopted yet, so it had to be adopted. I didn't look at codes that were more regional and county level. There's some codes that apply to an entire state. Those were not part of it. I also narrowed the list to just be areas that are within core metropolitan statistical areas. So that's basically, large urban counties. And the other thing I did is I did not include codes that were for entire cities like Miami and Denver, the entire metropolitan area, because, and the reason is that it's really hard to then just figure out what's a form-based code area and what is not a form-based code area. So because, if you're looking at an entire large city, you're going to have to include all the surrounding tracts. And, so if you want more details on that whole selection process, I'll give you the paper. So basically this study is about medium and small cities, towns, and neighborhoods. Also, I did include form-based codes that covered parts of large cities. For example, Phoenix has, there are areas in there that are now guided by form-based codes. So those were included. It was just if it was an entire large metropolitan area, I didn't include it. So the total number of codes that I looked at was 274. It's wrong direction. And Hazel already showed some of this data, but for the codes that I used, this was the kind of time span I was looking at. I also kind of cut it off at 2015 because I wanted to look at what the trends were up until 2020. So I'm looking at data over 3 different time periods, and I want to make sure I was capturing codes that might have had some relationship with 2020 data. So this is a map showing all those form-based code tracts. So of those 274 codes, the next step was to find out what census tracts they're located in. And that was a big project. And luckily I do have student workers available. That's really key to the success of any of this kind of research. But so they went through a good year actually going form-based code by form-based code and trying to figure out, well, what was the spatial delineation of these codes? What kind of area are they pertaining to? And trying to figure out what the boundaries of these codes are. And as you can imagine, that's not very straightforward. It's about looking through planning documents and looking through zoning ordinances. And in the end, we were able to flag about 1,000 form-based code tracts, as we call them. So the next step is, okay, so you have these form-based code tracts and you have a bunch of census data for those tracts. What can you say about them in a comparative way? So if you find that, they have a certain racial profile or whatever, that doesn't really mean much. You need to be able to compare them to something. So what I compared them to was the surrounding tracts. So they had to be tracts within as I mentioned, a core-based statistical area. I only retained tracts that had a minimum population threshold. So they had to have at least 50 people living in them. And so that final tally of surrounding tracts, that's the comparative tracts, was about 36,000. So you're comparing 1,000 form-based code tracts to a comparative set of 36,000. The other thing I really thought was important to do is to differentiate between tracts that are mostly suburban and kind of lower intensity use versus inner city, you know, downtown kind of form-based code areas or tracts. And so I used, I went through a process of a clustering technique using data from this source and basically differentiated tracts that were mostly suburban versus urban. So that's just two different categories that I used. And then, so basically, looking at those form-based code tracts, I wanted to look at what variables were associated, or in statistical parlance, you might say predicts, or you might say explains, away from the impact, which is causality. But what would predict the presence of a form-based code tract? Those are I talked at the beginning about thinking about equity issues and diversity and density. The dependent variable here is simply a dummy variable of whether or not the tract is a form-based code tract or not. And this is a table that kind of sums up everything that I found. So you can see for those 3 years of 2000, 2010, and 2020, looking at the associations of these different variables with whether it's suburban or urban as a tract. And plus sign means that there is a significant statistical difference in for a form-based code tract. So in other words, in 2000, the percentage of Hispanic for form-based codes tracts was higher in suburban and urban areas. The percentage of white was higher in 2010 and 2020. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that because it seems confusing. How can you have higher percentage white and higher percentage of, you know, in all these areas? What the racial situation can be a little confusing, how to pare all that down. You can, I guess I don't need to go into any of these in too much detail. You can kind of see what's shaking out here. I do want to spend a little time on something like income, which I think would be really interesting to folks. So income in my data, those form-based code tracts in urban locations, there was a higher median income for form-based code tracts in the urban areas. But there was actually a lower median income in suburban areas in all years. So I think that's pretty interesting and something to kind of think more about. Not a lot of difference between form-based code tracts and other tracts in terms of housing value. I did find lower median rent. Poverty rate was often higher. So, you know, some of these, there's a story here that I'm trying to get at and trying to parse out, but it's not always that easy to figure it out. I do want to just mention about these the 2010 to 2020 change variables. It does seem that in those suburban and urban locations, the percentage of white population was lower for form-based code tracts. The percentage of Black population was higher in suburban, and you can see some of these other trends going on. The density variable, the only thing I found was that high density housing types were higher in suburban locations for form-based code tracts. So this is actually my last slide. There's a lot of detail in the paper. I don't know if I'm doing a great job summarizing it all, but I think kind of the bottom line is that the picture here is kind of mixed. I would say that I think we are safe to say that form-based codes are not translating to a picture of gentrification and white affluence. I don't think that that's really a fair charge, looking at my data anyway. And the other kind of takeaway I'll say is that I was surprised at the differences between suburban and urban locations. And it seemed that the significance of form-based codes were more prominent in suburban as opposed to urban locations. With that, I think I will just stop and we'll go into a discussion.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I know Hazel has some questions and I have some questions as well. And Hazel, I had some questions on some of what you presented as well, just early on, things that jumped out to me that I was hoping we might discuss briefly. And I think what was most notable for me in looking at, the form-based codes that have been adopted in the last 30 plus years, was there seems to be a significant dip starting in 2010 all the way to about what looked to be 2016, 2017. And then there's this large spike, and you already kind of answered it, in that a lot of those are in progress, form-based codes that are in progress. But it just got me thinking, not just about the demographics and socioeconomic context that Emily's been studying in her work, but also about the kind of external economic forces. And I was curious what your thoughts were, if, how much of that dip that began in 2010 for the number of new form-based codes has to do with the Great Recession, and kind of how much development and economic cycles affect planning and zoning decisions, in particular in relation to form-based codes. And then also kind of why we think there is this large spike now in new form-based codes that are being created and hopefully eventually adopted. So I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that specifically.
You're muted, Hazel.
Thank you. Sorry. Well, I'm happy to take a first crack at that if you like. I mean, I think, once again, as Emily said, causality is pretty hard to determine in these studies in general. And maybe, so I'm not really sure precisely the answer to your question, but just from, the stories that people tell us about the form-based codes, I do think it is heavily associated with the housing crash in 2006. But also plenty of people use form-based codes to try to dig themselves out of economic challenges and remove sort of the barriers that usually stand in the way of development. So there are all sorts of reasons for doing them. Other people do them to, remove the systemic racism that is inherent in most land use law across the US with lot size minimums and that sort of thing.
Okay. Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I also was interested in just seeing how many more form-based codes there seem to be in Florida, California, and Texas. And, I was curious if you think that's a reflection of the firms that are located there, or potentially just the local planning history or preferences at the municipal level, or maybe probably a combination of both. But interesting to think about why there's disproportionately so many more in those states, and what that might mean for being able to implement more form-based codes in states that perhaps have a different history or, experience with form-based codes.
Well, those are three of the most populous states. So I think it probably tracks population in some ways, but, Florida being the home of so much new urbanist activity, that would be kind of expected. But I don't know exactly why does new urbanism happen in some places and not others. Hazel, thoughts? Rob?
I think it's a competitive thing, at least as much as I can tell. I mean, as we track these, we notice that the region starts competing with each other. So and when one area gets one and starts to show appreciable differences in urban form and town character and that sort of thing, the neighbors tend to take notice. And, we've certainly written plenty of form-based codes because a neighbor's form-based code was doing great things and somebody else in the region wanted one. So I think there's definitely that tipping point of good work generates competition, friendly competition.
Interesting. Great. I have another question for you, Emily, and I think it's just, looking at the work done on this research paper specifically, and the number of new form-based codes that are in progress, even just this year, it seems like a great moment to think about what types of information, specifically data, that cities and planning professionals should be measuring and tracking as we look to better understanding the impacts of these codes over time. With so many in progress right now, what advice would you have for cities and planning professionals who are interested in tracking key performance indicators related to form-based codes? To really help increase the amount of data and information we have for future studies like the one that you undertook.
That's a great question. And actually, I've thought about that a lot. Nobody does track this stuff. Even how many walkable places are there? What's our ability? What progress have we made in creating more walkable urbanism? I think that's we're not doing a good job of tracking all of that. And so the question is, whose responsibility is it to do that? I think that it would be great if CNU did that. And I actually or made that one of its key functions, but then how do you monetize that? Like somebody has to pay for that. That is, Hazel is doing all this volunteer work because it's a labor of love. I do this kind of research because that's what faculty are paid to do. They're supposed to be cranking out research papers. So whose municipalities, what would be their incentive to track this kind of information? I guess they do have that incentive, but they seem so stressed, just like keeping up with the basics of day-to-day planning work, who's really going to take on the research arm of it? So I would just put in a further plug for CNU to try to take it on. Mm-hmm. It's not a very good answer, but I think it's a great question though, because I think you really do need to have the numbers to promote this work and to promote the value of form-based codes. You need to keep tracking it. It's really essential.
Well, I know that because in a lot of cities we work, they're more and more interested in tracking themselves, all of these indicators, which can also then be used if they're adopting form-based codes. So it's an interesting question really to think about, especially who should be responsible and how we can be aggregating all the information.
And it doesn't have to be complicated. I mean, Scott Bernstein, who I know is on today's call, always says, it's hard to track more than like 7 things on the dashboard of a car. So start with simplicity. And so start with things like intersection density, start with so many of the things that are on Emily's study right now. And all of that data is predominantly accessible to local governments. So it really isn't hard or track greenhouse gas emissions per household before, at the time of adoption, for sure. Make sure you're benchmarking everything at the time of adoption, and then tracking, those sorts of evaluations over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you mentioned intersection density, because there was a study that came out earlier this year. I don't know if you saw it, Emily, where somebody had looked at development on street grids and found that there was a major return to development on street grids since the year 2000, which seemed quite surprising to me.
Huh.
So I wrote an article on it in Public Square, and I think he attributed a number of different factors. Just people moving back into cities and towns was one of them, but also the changes in codes which were encouraging these sorts of grid patterns. But
Was that Jeff Boeing?
yes,
Was that the Jeff Boeing?
yes, yeah.
Great work.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of came, obviously he's doing work in that area as well. I just wanted to mention that we might want to begin going to Q&A at some point.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hazel, I don't know if you wanted to ask any of your questions, but I'm already looking at some of the Q&A questions, and I'll give you a chance to ask anything you wanted to Emily's research before I start.
Let's jump to the Q&A because my
Okay.
questions are so absurdly nerdy that we'll just save mine to the end if we have time. Otherwise,
Okay.
Emily's promised me, one long evening of going through mine in detail. Thank you, though, Luiza.
Sure. So we had a question early on from Paul, and it's pretty specific. He was curious about Maryland. He noticed that it was not on the list of states that Emily was looking at with form-based codes. But so it was just kind of a specific question, and you may not know off the top of your head if there are actually any form-based codes in Maryland. I imagine there are. I think you have that in your graph.
I had two
Yeah.
in Maryland.
Okay, so obviously Emily's research didn't look at every single form-based code that you see listed on the codestudy.org. So there's many more than were selected based on specific criteria for Emily's study and research. So
Yeah.
that clears that up. A lot of interest, Patricia mentioning, how useful this kind of research would be for, getting into a lot of different outcomes beyond just demographics, socioeconomic demographics. We have a question from Marilyn. What do you think about the high rental rates you found in form-based code places? Do we have to trade off building equity or home ownership for walkability, environment, etc.?
So, well, I found that the housing value, there wasn't a lot of difference. And in fact, it was just lower in 2000. Rent was lower in tracts with form-based codes. And by the way, I want to bring up something that Rob actually brought up to me from the very beginning of when I told him about this study. We're looking at tracts, and that, the form-based codes don't align with tracts. Then this is a liability of this study. The form-based code might be for a much smaller section of an entire tract. So that's actually a caveat that I wanted to mention. But I guess the question was about the percentage of rental units being higher in form-based code tracts in all years. That's actually a good thing, right? I think that that's a good thing. Don't we need more rental units?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it really speaks to the fact that form-based codes try to create naturally occurring affordable housing plus naturally occurring affordable transportation. So I think that your study affirms that it doesn't speak to the transportation part, which is one of my nerdy questions we can talk about later. But for the housing part, your study affirms that is being achieved to some extent.
Great. There was a question also earlier, I forgot. It was asking about the actual shape files for the study control areas. So is that information, Emily, that's available or shared anywhere if people are interested in the kind of clusters you were looking at specifically?
Yeah, I possibly maybe. It's the sense, yeah. Could that person please just email me and we'll talk about that, about possibly sharing data.
Sure.
Talon at uchicago.edu. I'll put it in the chat.
Great. We had another question from David Weeks, again, looking at the kinds of things that could be studied more closely. Was there any analysis of political party affiliation for communities with form-based codes? It's one way of knowing, are the communities adopting form-based codes skewing more liberal or more conservative comparatively? It didn't seem like that was one of the items on your list of variables, but an interesting.
I love that idea. I love that idea. I mean, now that I have all the form-based code tracks, I want to partner with people to look at other things like political affiliation. I think that would be really interesting. I didn't look at that, but you.
Yeah.
But be careful, Emily, because when we get hired to write form-based codes, I never, ever look at local political affiliation, because for me, it just doesn't matter. I feel like, you can want to advance walkable, compact, mixed use, high performance urbanism from both sides of the aisle. And making it a political football, I think, only potentially hurts the cause instead of helps it, because I've never gone back and looked at for the 111 units of municipal government that we've worked for. I've never gone back and looked at that, because I don't even want to know. So anyway, that would just be my, yes, planning is politics in so many ways, but I would love form-based codes to not become too much that way, just because we need everybody at the wheel, to get the sort of returns that they are producing.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, but if
just
you
one
found,
opinion.
okay, no, I get that. But we're also not afraid of the empirical truth, right? But what if we found that form-based codes tended to be in Republican areas? We could shame the Democrats, like, oh, you think you're progressive Democrats? Well, sorry, you're not doing well. So there might be I don't know how it would play out. I honestly don't know.
Me
It'd
either.
be really interesting. I mean, looking at the places that have the most form-based codes, I think it's pretty interesting. Just right there as a piece of information that California, Texas, and Florida are where you have the most. And obviously you'd have to go at a much more granular level to understand exactly what the party affiliation or political affiliations would be. But, looking at those three states, my best guess is that it would be more varied than you might think.
Yeah, I like that idea. That might have to be my next paper. Whoever was writing about that, please do get in touch.
There's another question here, similarly, about different ways we can look at this. Is that, have you ever thought about comparing, this is from Patricia, have you ever thought about comparing organic traditional neighborhood communities versus those planned with form-based codes? So like the naturally occurring traditional neighborhood versus a new neighborhood with regulated through a form-based code.
That'd be interesting. I wonder how you could, as a practical matter, how you would make that differentiation. Maybe, I mean, people have been using things like intersection density and block size and lot size to try to figure out where are the walkable, places with walkable urban form. So that might be your kind of base, and you could compare that to form-based code tracks. That'd be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
However, so many of the form-based codes apply to the town center or the central business district or downtown that are already walkable urban form and that have the intersection density in place to support the sorts of, compact mixed use, the building addressing the street sort of formats that form-based codes generally try to generate. So it's very tricky. We've thought about that quite a bit, and it's harder to do than you might think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we find that, we create form-based codes in areas that have already kind of traditional development patterns and they're wanting to preserve that. And that's the reason they're actually looking for a form-based code. So it's a good point. Another question in regards to your findings is from Scott Bernstein. Is there any discernible relationship between the findings denoted by a plus and minus and which firms took the lead on designing these 200 plus codes?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Is there any discernible relationship between the findings denoted by a plus and minus and which firms took the lead on designing these 200 codes?
Oh, which
That's-
firms took the lead?
Mhm.
Okay, another good topic for research. I think that that data is there, the firms that are associated with these form-based codes. So that could be plugged in. It is not something that I looked at. Hazel, it's all there, right?
It is and it isn't. I mean, we stopped tracking that just because this is a volunteer effort. And over time, so many groups of people tend to be involved in updates to, some other firm's code. So the code study does track lead firms and sub-consultants usually for the first form-based code. And if it's something that's published and knowable for the revision, often that's in there too. But we just were spending so much time when it was published, when we used to publish that column, having people debate it, that I just stopped publishing that column because it became just too time consuming. But the data is in there, but people would debate the veracity of it.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to keep track when it's actually adopted or not. Oh, we lost our amazing moderator.
Uh-oh. Hazel, you're still actively putting new codes on there on a daily basis?
I am.
Or
We are in the process of updating our website. And so I haven't updated the codestudy.org portal in a while, but I am updating the underlying information. It does need time and effort. So before your next big paper, Emily, give me a 6-month warning, and I'll try to stop doing other volunteer work and come back and volunteer on this one for a bit as well.
okay.
Ooh, are we to my questions now? Or Rob, are you here to make us stop talking?
No, I'm just jumping in to maybe help to answer the Q&A, but Luiza looks like she's coming back now. Luiza, are you with us?
Yes, so sorry. Can you hear me? My
Yep.
computer just had a meltdown.
Is there a way
Luiza, may I jump
That's
in here with a question
Yeah.
real quick as you're
Yeah, absolutely.
reorienting? Sorry, Emily.
No, can I just ask, is there a way do these chat questions get reserved or retained? Because people are putting in some really good ideas about research that needs to be done on form-based codes. And I feel like it's really cool that they're coming up with all these ideas, and I would like to have that information kept. I don't know.
I
guess
think
it's a
the
question for
chat
Rob.
can be, I think we can keep the chat, but I'll look into that.
Okay, thanks.
So
Okay.
Emily, my biggest question for you is really about density. And in your paper on page 8, part 5, under results, you say, and I quote, finally, population density was lower for FBC tracts in urban locations in all decades. There was no significant difference in suburban locations, but yet later on you say, and I quote, the low and medium density housing was sporadically lower. What is interesting is the sustained level of higher levels of high density housing forms for FBC tracts in all time periods and both suburban and urban locations. So I guess what my question is how can population density be lower if low and medium density housing is lower and high density is higher, does that just mean that form-based code areas have a lower total population?
Yeah, I mean, this is just, the tract level density is the whole tract, area of the whole tract divided by population, right? So with the three different housing types are really looking at, well, how much is single family dwelling, how much is in the missing middle, and how much is the higher, high rise stuff. And so it's interesting that it can still be, overall, there isn't more population density in form-based code tracts. In fact, it's lower in the urban ones, but still you do have more higher density housing being built. So that just kind of goes to show, don't only look at population density as your measure. You have to look at what are the different types of housing being built. So
then a
that's
So a follow-up question to that is,
Okay.
so considering crowding, especially, in the post-COVID era, hopefully post-COVID, if all things go better than they have been, are form-based codes, do you think your study it indicates that our form-based codes are helping with both low and high density places move toward a more gentle density?
I don't know what do you mean by gentle density?
So like the medium density.
The medium one. I mean, my data didn't show that. My data showed that it was the high density types that were consistently, form-based code tracts had more of that. But not in the medium level. But what was my high density? I forget what that cutoff was.
Okay. All right. Susan says 5. Oh yeah. 5 plus units per structure.
Okay. That's pretty gentle.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be good to I mean, I'm a victim of how the census is differentiating things,
Right.
So, and they only it's a pretty crude category of 5 plus units in a structure.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what you're showing there. So, it could very well be that it is a gentle density.
So, I mean, I think one of the biggest things I want to understand from this study is, how does it change the story of what we've been talking about for the last 40 years of what is a form-based code and what does it do? And how does it affirm the story that we've been hoping for? So we know, we were hoping for things like, wealth. And you say, interestingly, medium income and medium rent were actually lower in form-based code tracts in suburban locations across all decades. Although from 2010 to 2020, suburban form-based code tracts became wealthier at a faster rate. And when you say wealthier, do you just mean in terms of increasing median income?
Yeah.
Okay. So then we didn't consider any sort of transportation affordability in this particular study. Is that right?
No.
All right. Wish list for the next one.
Yeah. That would be a good one to include. Yeah, but I think that the overall story is really positive. I mean, I was happy with the results, and I'm a form-based code advocate, and this is not, like I said, this is not alarm bells about, this is all white people and gentrification. I don't think that's fair at all. And I think that this data shows that it's a lot more nuanced than that. So I think the message is, if people start throwing that at a form-based code as a critique of it, there might be some room to push back on such critique.
Great. We have a couple of questions about how the form-based codes and areas were selected. Also, there was a question about whether the form-based codes that were included in the study, were those all municipal form-based codes, or were there some developer form-based codes included? So that was one question that we got.
They're 100% municipal. Developer-driven form-based codes that are regulated like a covenant code and restriction sort of format for a private development are not included in codestudy.org. So therefore, they wouldn't be an Emily study either.
Mm-hmm. And then Marshall Hines has a question about, what the selection was like. He says there's obviously been some codes that have been more successfully implemented than others. Did that at all play into which ones were selected for the study? Or was it just a more kind of quantitative criteria in the ones you were including or not?
Yeah, I don't know what is meant by successful. You mean in terms of whether or not it's people are abiding by it as new development is happening or something like that?
Or even how much new development has been
much
constructed under the new code and under the new regulations? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that nuance is not in there. This is a really large format, quantitative, the entire country kind of study, and it what's needed is digging down for particular locations. Hazel and Cade Benfield did an amazing job trying to figure out how to look at all the studies that have been done, trying to figure out what has been the economic value in particular of these codes. So that research is there, and I would encourage anyone to go to that website to try to find that answer.
I'm going to jump in here and just say that we're a little bit past the hour, and it's scheduled to go for 1 hour. However, we can continue because we have a lot to talk about if you all want to continue for another half an hour or so. And those who have to drop out can watch the video, which will be posted on cmu.org in a day or so. And we'll try to get to your questions if they're not answered yet.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask one thing. There's many other questions are dealing with, the various kinds of form-based codes and areas where they're adopted, like small towns, like entire cities or revitalization areas and the various impacts. I was curious as to whether, your data, or whether we know what is the impact on small towns at all from this. From your research, or maybe Hazel's research?
Well, I mean, the most I differentiated was between urban and suburban. So, and, taking out all the big cities that are not part of it. So the focus is on small towns and medium-sized cities. But parsing it more than that, I didn't really do. Hazel, did you have just some general thoughts?
I haven't specifically looked at that, Rob, with the exception of the few specific form-based code studies that are reflected on codescore.org. And so those are usually self-reported from the cities and towns themselves, and usually look at things like new development, pre and post adoption. They look at things like increased property value for the 9 months pre and post adoption. They look at things like, development applications for the 9 to 12 months pre and post adoption. They look at things like estimated number of cars that would be taken off the road if 100% of new development were to occur under the optional form-based code that was just adopted versus continuing as business as usual. So those sorts of questions are what mostly they answer, but I can't definitively tell you if small towns have generally been more or less successful than medium-sized cities or large metros. I don't know. Good question.
Mhm. There's a question also about transit and how that factors into the work. So not in the selection of the clusters, and I know you separated primarily by suburban versus urban, but if there would be any way to take that data and look more closely at the transit networks in both the suburban and urban areas you looked at and be able to compare that. When we think about walkability and DMT and other kind of indicators for greenhouse gas emissions and similar things. So was that something that was part of the data set you were collecting?
No, but I would think that the urban tracts would be the ones with transit as opposed to the suburban ones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could do that. You could certainly have some kind of indicator for the tract on whether or not it's got a transit stop within it. But I wonder what the added value, explanatory value of that would be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something to look at, sure.
Yeah, great. And there's a great question here by Robert. And he says, it seems that form-based codes are only one piece, a critical one of a larger set of policies needed to ensure affordable, stable housing. Have you come across any that have been adopted in coordination with policies to help limit displacement and produce affordable housing? And I know you mentioned this in your paper, so I was curious if you wanted to elaborate on that, Emily, and you too, Hazel.
So this is a question about a form-based code adoption being paired with affordable housing policies to ensure
Yes.
that form-based code doesn't, price people out.
Yeah.
I don't think that is very common. I think that is something that needs to happen. Although, again, I'm not seeing evidence from my data that we should all be like freaking out about form-based codes, making things unaffordable. Right now, we don't have data showing that that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. Jurisdiction by jurisdiction, that might be something to look at, but it's, I don't know. And if that is happening, absolutely, we need to be proactive about making sure that, what we want is walkable places that managed by a form-based code to make them more walkable. And we want everyone to be able to live there. That's the holy grail. And so we try to do what we can. If we're just focused on the form-based code piece and we don't care about the other piece, that is not okay. But again, I'm not seeing huge red flags.
Even though you're not seeing huge red flags, which is such great news about this study, and we're so grateful for all your hard work on that, Emily. I get your point, Luiza, because, or the caller's point that, or the Zoomer's point, that yes, the form-based code does help establish naturally occurring affordable housing by removing minimum lot sizes, by reducing or eliminating parking minimums, and by allowing gentle density or higher density housing types, and then all sorts of affordable lifestyles choices that we know of. But still, in many places that are hot housing markets, that's still not enough to create that natural affordability that the form-based code supports. And so other people are trying to pair, other places, some municipalities are trying to pair form-based code adoptions with things like transfer of development rights, which really only works in very expensive marketplaces where there can be a more fluidity in that market and more liquidity. And that just has very rarely actually worked well. The thing that we're seeing work more frequently is the establishment of land trusts, and the municipal government actually, in some cases, becoming a developer themselves with with, making covenants for permanently affordable housing or 20-year affordable housing or that sort of thing. So those are the other sorts of policy related and, P3 related sorts of initiatives.
Great. There was another interesting question here looking specifically at median income. If the median income increase was done on a dollar value or percentage basis, and also was that median income increase, how does that compare to the cost of living increase? Is that something you had looked at seeing, if there was also a subsequent cost of living increase?
No, but it's, it's simply the median income statistic by tract that's reported by the. But I think you're asking would the percent change be in present value? And that's a good question. I don't remember if I did that or not. Because 2020 median income is not comparable to 2010. Sorry, I don't remember if I present valued that. But it's, I can look into that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And just a couple more questions. So, other people here are interested also in infrastructure improvements and enhancements. One question, do you think infrastructure improvements would make cities in the Midwest, for example, look more closely into form-based codes from an economic point of view? Or do you think the introduction of new infrastructure like electric charging stations would have on regions that have fewer form-based codes? So I guess, some of the attendees are just interested in how, built infrastructure might correlate with form-based codes. I'm not sure if there are any thoughts specifically on that. We mentioned it a little bit with transit. I know that wasn't the focus necessarily of the study, but it'd be interesting to know, for example, if the adoption of a form-based code potentially facilitated infrastructure improvements, for example, street improvements, things like that, that go hand in hand with land use planning.
Mm-hmm.
They have to, especially in places where the form-based code is a mandatory requirement and where there is a rezoning that maps the new form-based zoning districts into place. If it's just an optional overlay, then the local government doesn't necessarily have to do those infrastructure upgrades. But like the worst of all possible worlds, and one of the few times that we've seen form-based codes repealed is when a city or a town adopts a mandatory form-based code and doesn't do the street improvements to make that a pedestrian and cyclist friendly street, but that they're asking the buildings to pull up to the edge of a wide fast street. And that's zero setbacks and fast cars with no street trees or on street parking is just literally a collision waiting to happen. So that it's very important. I mean, we often say land use first, transportation second, but the transportation second part does have to come, and it has to come in the form of investment as well as planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's especially interesting when thinking about these indicators of health and walkability, how much of that is a result specifically of some of those open space and street improvements that often come along with form-based codes.
My study was really about the residential part of form-based codes, but I think it's a really good point to look at the infrastructure piece of it. So question for Hazel, what percentage of form-based codes do you think have both the private and public sector regulated within them?
Wow, I think most of them, especially in the United States, definitely regulate both the public and the private realm. They have, they have street standards and sidewalk standards that are part of it. So if you're doing infill or adaptive reuse and you're only doing a very small footprint of a lot, then you may or may not have to do any public realm upgrades. But if you're a developer who's redeveloping multiple lots for either adaptive reuse, infill, or greenfield, then you will be contributing to the public realm in streets, sidewalks, and civic spaces, parks, plazas, playgrounds, community gardens, that sort of thing. So they tend to be, unified development codes that deal with both the public and private side of life. Luiza, may I answer a friend and colleague in my own region who's saying, what does gentle density mean, that I keep saying it today? And, it means different things in different places. And in our region, John, it is, sometimes gentle density here means getting some of the rural municipalities to agree with 4 dwelling units per acre, because people want 2-acre lot sizes. And so, but in other places, it means, something much more dense than that. So from my perspective, it's, kind of missing middle housing in some ways, but more than that, it's that gentle densification to take us up to the next level of kind of evolution of a place.
So I'm going to thank our panelists now for Hazel and Emily and Luiza for a wonderful discussion on form-based codes. It's been really interesting. It gets technical at times, but the coding is absolutely critical to what everybody is trying to do here. And thank all of the participants. And we've had a good number of participants on an August day when a lot of people are on vacation. So thank everybody for being part of this. And once again, this will be posted on cnu.org. And we'll see everybody at a future On the Park Bench webinar. We'll be continuing to do this a couple of times a month. So everybody take care and have a good rest of your August.
And thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for organizing.
Yes, thank you so much.
Much appreciated.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.